Just as the gods fall into a contradictory relation with the self-like nature opposed to them, so too their universality comes into conflict with their own specific character and its relationship to others. They are the eternal, beautiful individuals who, serene in their own existence, are exempt from transitoriness and the influence of alien powers. But they are at the same time specific elements, particular gods, which therefore stand in relation to others. But that relation to others, which in virtue of the opposition involved in it is a conflict with them, is a comical self-forgetfulness of their eternal nature. Determinateness is rooted in their divine existence and possesses in its limitation the independence of the whole individuality. Through this, their characters at once lose the sharpness of their peculiar disposition and blend together in their ambiguity. One purpose of the activity, and their activity itself, since it is directed against an other, and hence against an invincible divine power, is an arbitrary showing off which at once melts away and transforms the apparent earnestness of the action into a harmless, self-confident play without result or outcome. If, however, in the nature of their divinity, the negative element or the specific determinateness of that nature appears merely as the inconsistency of their activity and as the contradiction between purpose and result, and if that independent assurance retains the preponderance over the element of determinateness, then by that very fact, the pure power of the negative confronts it. And, moreover, as the ultimate power over it and against it, which it can do nothing. They are the universal and the positive over against the individual self of mortals, which cannot hold out against their might. But the universal self, for that reason, hovers over them and over this whole world of picture thinking to which the entire content belongs, as the irrational void of necessity, a mere happening, which they must face as beings without a self and sorrowfully, for these determinate natures cannot find themselves in this purity. Paragraph 731 is not all that long. It's not a short paragraph either, but it is a very dense paragraph. There's a lot going on in this one. And one of the central questions that Hegel isn't asking directly, but is being worked through in this paragraph is which universal, which allgemein or Allgemeinheit is truly the universal. And what we see here is that individual or particular gods, specific gods, are presented in certain ways as if they are universal, but there's a universal above them, the universal self that we were talking about in previous paragraphs. And these gods exist, each of them, in a plurality. We brought up the idea of a pantheon in paragraphs before this and noted that while there can be a ruler of the pantheon, it's not like a systematic ordering and Ordnung of the gods. And this is all being represented by human beings as well. It's very important to remember that this is religion in the form of art, and the art here is the art of language being used by the epic producer. We had earlier the artisan, we could say, the Meister, who was making statues and things like that. And then we moved to the Künstler, the artist as such, still making statues or other depictions. And now we're doing it in language with the minstrel, who is producing a work, an epic. We're also going to have tragedy coming up very soon. We're also going to have comedy coming up after that. You notice that the word comic shows up in this paragraph as well. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on here in relation to the God. And we should remind ourselves of what happened in the previous paragraph, right? There's this interplay between divine and human being. Now there's more emphasis placed on the gods themselves, but there is a contradictory relation that we begin with. And the word contradictory there is not Widerspruch, it's not even Gegensatz, it's Entgegengesetzte, right? So what we're talking about is really opposition more than direct contradiction. These are all different terms that they're not like totally closed off against each other, but you could say, signify more intense degrees of opposition or contradiction. So what do we have going on here? Well, let's begin with this. Just as the gods fall into a contradictory relation with the self-like nature, Natur, right, opposed to them, so too their universality comes into conflict. So that's interesting. They have universality, right? But their universality comes into conflict with what at first? It's going to come into conflict with all sorts of stuff, as we're going to see. What does Hegel say first? With their own specific character and its relationship, Beziehung, to others. So its own specific character. Each god has, when we think about pantheons, again, I've brought this up before, we often have this mistaken view that it's like a nice, systematic, everything, is in its proper box. Each god is in charge of their own domain. There aren't any overlaps or, messy interferences with each other. When actually it's more like each of them has carved out their space or had a space assigned to them. Maybe Hephaestus, the great craftsman god, would actually like to do some music once in a while. But, Apollo's got that locked up over here. Or, it's not as if Artemis is the only god who likes to hunt, but, she's the goddess associated with that. And sometimes it's according with the Greek stories, according to some sort of fair mechanism, like when Zeus and his two brothers, Poseidon and Hades, cast lots for who's going to be in charge of what domain. Sometimes it might be just, somebody gravitates towards something. Why is Hestia the goddess of the hearth? Is there an explanation for that? Well, in any case, they all have their specific besondere characters, their own domains, right? And they are related to others. So he goes on and he says, these gods are eternal. That's going to come up in relation to mortals, right? Eternal, beautiful individuals who, serene in their own existence, are exempt from transitoriness and the influence, this is kind of an interesting thing, influence of alien powers. Now, there is going to be a power, and really an alien power, to whom they're subject, but that's going to come up a little bit later. So at the start, we're talking about the gods not being coercible. They get to decide for themselves what they're going to do. They have genuine freedom as opposed to us, human mortal schmucks down here in this complex, determinate world that, imposes all sorts of things upon us. And maybe even the gods impose things upon us, so we don't have the freedom that they have. And we're also lacking one kind of really important freedom. They are deathless. They are eternal. They are free from the transitory world. Now, of course, in the theogonies, we have gods being brought to birth, sometimes in, quite unusual circumstances. Sometimes, a god and a goddess get together and get it on, and boom, you got Hephaestus. Sometimes it's, you castrate somebody and throw their balls in the sea, and boom, you've got Aphrodite coming out of there. Sometimes Zeus swallows up some mortal human who he had sex with and gets a terrible headache, and Hephaestus has to cleave his head open with an axe, and out pops Athena, right? There's all different stories. So the gods have beginnings. Zeus himself Hera, his sister and wife, have origins in the copulation of the Titans, Kronos and Rhea, right? And they themselves were produced by Uranos and Gaia, right? So there's a theogony there. But once the gods exist, they're for all time. They're not like us poor bastards who are going to die, right? And so he says they're serene in their own existence. They're exempt from transitoriness. They're not going to, if we want to be kind of silly about this, their hair is not going to turn gray on them. I mean, some of the gods are depicted as having white hair, but, if they don't want to have white hair, they don't have to, right? They're not going to get pimples that they have to deal with. They're not going to, actually, we have to be a little bit careful with this. What about Hephaestus? Zeus throws him out of heaven when he's protecting his mom, Hera, against Zeus, and he falls for 3 days, and when he lands, he hurts his leg, and he's lame afterwards. So perhaps, what Hegel's talking about here is more of an ideal than a reality. He goes in and says, they are at the same time specific elements, particular gods. Notice that he's not saying individual at this point, specific and particular. Besondere, right? Determinate, bestimmt. Which therefore stand in relation, Beziehung, to others. So the question is, well, what kind of relation is this? Is it really like, hey, man, good to see you. How's the, we're talking to Apollo, how's the prophecy thing going today? Oh, it's going great. How are you doing, Hephaestus? Is your ironworking coming along well? No, it's not quite like that. Instead, what we see, he says, that relation to others, which in virtue of the opposition, and now we see the same word being used that was translated at the beginning as contradictory, and Gegensetzen, being set, so Setzen, right, being placed in, you could say, antagonistic or opposition relation to each other, literally being set as against the other, right? But also at a distance from the other, the ent coming from that. So they are entgegengesetzt. They are in opposition to each other. And then he says this, in virtue of the opposition involved in it, is a conflict with them. Streit in German. A struggle, a battle. A conflict works fine. They don't see eye to eye. They don't completely line up with each other. It's not as if they're going to, this isn't the struggle to the death and they're going to destroy each other or some sort of death match of the gods or any silly nonsense like that. But there is opposition between them. And, if we pause here for a moment and we think about, we're talking about epics, right? What do we have as examples of this? Let's take Homer, right? In the Iliad, we actually have a conflict that sets off the whole thing between three goddesses over this apple that one of the stir-the-pot kind of goddesses, Eris, goddess of strife, caused, right? And who's the most beautiful of them all? Is it Aphrodite, Athena, or Hera? They're going to be in strife with each other, and they're also going to be lined up on opposite sides in the Trojan War that is going to follow from that after Helen gets taken from Menelaus by Alexander or, Paris. He's got two names. And this brings about this massive, naval flotilla dropping off Greeks to fight the Trojans. And the gods themselves are involved on one side or another. They fight each other. They fight mortals. They are in conflict. So he goes on and he says, this is a comical self-forgetfulness of their eternal nature. Comical. Keep that in mind later on. Self-forgetfulness of their eternal nature. This is the more important part here. The universal, that is the God, forgets that it's completely universal. He goes on and he says, determinateness is rooted in their divine existence and possesses in its limitation the independence of the whole individuality. By being individuals, by being determinate, bestimmt, right, being particular gods, they are placed into opposition with other gods who are also the universals, right? But we could say these are universals that aren't fully universal anymore, and neither is their conflict. And we have a plurality here, not just a duality. We have a whole network of determinations of individuality of gods in relation to each other. He goes on and he says, through this their characters at once lose the sharpness of their peculiar disposition and blend together in their ambiguity, in their two-sidedness. So each god on their own is not quite what you think they are. And they themselves don't fully grasp their own individuality, you could say, either. Let's go on with this. Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. One purpose of the activity, and their activity itself, since it's directed against an other, and hence an invincible divine power, is an arbitrary showing off, which at once melts away and transforms the apparent earnestness of the action into a harmless, self-confident play without result or outcome. So when gods fight, when gods go to war, when gods conflict, when gods mess with each other, like, for example, one of the prime examples of this in Greek mythology is little Hermes, who's stealing stuff from Apollo, right? Apollo is, by this time, a very powerful god, son of Zeus, sister of Artemis. They've managed to survive the jealousy of Hera. Hera's rightfully jealous because Zeus screws around on her at every opportunity and generates a bunch of little godlets. There's a whole story. Well, lots of stories to be told there. Hermes, as a little guy, is, messing around with Apollo, right? And he's going to learn his lesson and all of that. And we could talk about other gods and goddesses coming into conflict. Prime example of this as well would be Ares and Aphrodite screwing around. Aphrodite is cheating on Hephaestus with his brother, and Hephaestus says, I'm going to put an end to this crap. He creates a net which catches them in their bed, pulls them up in the air, and everybody laughs at him. Look at those dummies, And they're also kind of laughing at Hephaestus a little bit as well, right? So, is this serious? Is this play? There is the possibility of gods being hurt and wounded. I've mentioned this a number of times. In the Iliad, a human being is able, because of the machinations of another god, Athena, to see Aphrodite, and he sticks her with a spear and chases her around, right? Could he kill her? We don't really know, right? So in any case, what's going on here? An arbitrary showing off, harmless, self-confident play. But there's another side to this. He says, if, however, in the nature of their divinity, the negative element or the specific determinateness of that nature appears merely as the inconsistency of their activity and the contradiction between purpose and result. So we're bringing in categories that we earlier discussed, particularly in the morality section, but also in parts of the reason section as well, when we were looking at ethical life and the Zaka Zelps, the ethical project, or whatever we want to translate that as, and really running throughout much of the spirit section, this incongruity, this slippage between purpose, Zweck, and result, the consequences of what it is that you do. Actions almost never lead exactly to what they were supposed to, particularly when they're actions, you could say, in an antagonistic setting, actions where somebody else is also acting or counter-responding, and where you have other people looking on and saying, oh, you're doing the right thing, you're doing the wrong thing. backing up a little bit, the inconsistency of their activity and contradiction, right? So there is contradiction or opposition not just between God and God, but within the very action of a God and the making sense of the interaction between them. Is it merely comedic? Well, I mean, then the gods are just what? Entertainment for us? Buffoons that screw around because nobody can ever be hurt? It's sort of like a video game where you have infinite lives and, people just get off on hearing about how the gods tricked each other, cheated each other, did stuff to each other. Is that much of a god? Would a god himself or herself be cool with that if they could look out of the stories and the temples in which they are being depicted and see the mortals saying, "Look at those jackasses!" And they've got infinite power and all they do is mess around with each other. There's a counter response to that, right? And there should be for a rational creature. So he says, if that independent assurance retains the preponderance over the element of determinateness, then by that very fact, and here we get now we're moving towards the actual universal, the pure power of the negative, the reine Macht, the negative, something that was invoked early on in the preface, something that is part of the Hegelian, we won't say method, because that implies a little bit too schematic of a thing, but let's call it Hegelian approach, to look to the negative, because the negative matters. It's not just a product of our projecting it out there, and it's not quite the same thing as the Heideggerian nichts, or nothing, but the negative plays a role. It's always there, ready to come in what is positive. And this is all positive stuff, right? Hegel's actually going to say that the God is positive, positiv, as opposed to the human mortals, the Sterblichen, the dying people. So the power of the negative is coming in here. The pure power of the negative. Not determinate negation as such, but something else. So he says this is the ultimate power over against it, and against which it can do nothing. It meaning the God. Right? This independent assurance, that's what we're talking about here, retains the preponderance over the element of determinateness. The element of determinateness is the God. They can become aware of their own position here, where they are conditioned by the negative. And we're going to come back to this in a moment. He says the gods are the universal and the positive over against the individual self of mortals, those who die, right? Which cannot hold out against their might, but the universal self, the true universal, hovers over them and over this whole world of picture thinking, Vorstellung. This is all the gods and mortals and God's relations to other gods. This is all being presented as picture thinking or representation. That doesn't mean it's not real. It's just the mode in which it is being generated, the mode of images, the mode of memory, the mode of associations of words and concepts and actions. There is something less universal about picture thinking, even when it is standing in as a universal, as it can do. Think about any painting that you like, Van Gogh's Starry Sky, right? That's not just a particular starry sky conditioned by his own interesting way of seeing and depicting. It's a stand-in for a starry sky for us. And we can learn something about the nature of the sky as we could be perceiving it by looking at how he's presenting it, how he's, how it's vorgestellt, placed in front of us by Van Gogh, right? A guy who's long dead. Well, the same thing we can say with the minstrel or bard's depiction of the gods that's going on here. But the gods themselves are subject to something higher, to fate, Schicksal. Hegel doesn't use that term here, or to something that's a little bit more straightforward, metaphysical, Notwendigkeit, necessity, right? So he tells us, and here we have to be careful about Miller's translation. I don't understand why Miller translated things this way, but I'm not going to go off on him too much, knowing how difficult translation is. He goes on and he says, the universal self hovers over them, gods and mortals, and over this whole world that they're part of picture thinking, to which the entire content belongs, as the irrational void of necessity. Now, irrational? Okay, you could read that in there, but it's not what the German says. The German says begrifflose, conceptless or notionless. All right? If you're taking Miller's translation of Begriff as notion. Most people translate it as concept, and Begriff and Vorstellung belong to each other as one is greater than the other, right? One is a different mode. The entire phenomenology itself is trying to get us to a, Begriff, and a whole bunch of Begreifendes of this development of history and consciousness over time, right? So it's not an accidental thing contrasting Begriff and Vorstellung here, and Miller kind of lost. He took his eyes off the prize, as we could say, in this one as translating it as irrational. Now, could it be irrational? Yes, that does make sense. Irrational meaning that there's no logos to it, no explanation to it. It's just necessity, right? He says irrational void of necessity. And void there, Leere, right? Der Notwendigkeit. An empty space, nothing there to say, a kind of muteness. There's necessity and there's no explanation for it. There's no reason or rhyme to it. There's nothing behind it because it's a void, right? How are you going to go behind a void? There's nothing to get behind there. So he says this is a mere happening which they must face as beings without a self, and sorrowfully, for these determinate natures cannot find themselves in this purity. So we're confronted with something, dynamic here. There's universals aplenty. The genuine universal appears to be something just arbitrary. It's, in a way, Notwendigkeit, especially if it's an empty space, a Leere, a void of necessity, is kind of better than fate, right? Because fate actually implies there's something positive to it. And we've got a real, tension here between this rich, incredibly interesting world of picture thinking in which the gods, forget themselves and discover themselves, and we mortals are kind of along for the ride. Looking at the previous paragraph, we actually have much more of a role in it than we realize, or at least the heroes among us do. And then this is just the way it is, that the gods themselves have to recognize, and they will recognize this in the epic of the minstrel.